For millions of couples, the answer is abort the daughter, try for a son. In China and northern India, more than 120 boys are being born for every 100 girls. Nature dictates that slightly more males are born than females to offset boys' greater susceptibility to infant disease, but nothing on this scale. For those who oppose abortion, this is mass murder. For those such as this newspaper who think abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, to use Bill Clinton's phrase, a lot depends on the circumstances, but the cumulative consequences for societies of such individual actions is catastrophic. China alone stands to have as many unmarried young men, bare branches, as they are known, as the entire population of young men in America. In any country, rootless young males spell trouble. I guess that's true. In Asian societies where marriage and children are the recognized routes into society, single men are almost like outlaws. Crime rates, bride trafficking, sexual violence, even female suicide rates are all rising and will rise further as the lopsided generations reach their maturity. It is no exaggeration to call this gendercide. Women are missing in their millions, aborted, killed, neglected to death. In 1990, an Indian economist, Amartya Sen, put the number at 100 million. The toll is higher now. The crumb of comfort is that countries can mitigate the hurt, and that one, South Korea, has shown the worst can be avoided. Others need to learn from it if they are to stop the carnage. So it goes on to offer some more details. The imbalance in China between the sexes was 108 boys to 100 girls in the late 80s. In the early 2000s, it was 124 to 100. In some Chinese provinces, the ratio is an unprecedented 130 to 100. The destruction is worst in China, but is spread far beyond. Gendercide exists on almost every continent. It affects rich and poor, educated and illiterate, Hindu, Muslim, Confucian, and Christian alike. So I find it interesting that both articles sort of invoke this. No matter what, this is true, right? It's true across the spectrum of wealth, of religion, of politics, that kind of thing. He goes on to say, wealth does not stop it. Taiwan and Singapore have open, rich economies. Within China and India, the areas with the worst sex ratios are the richest, best educated ones. And China's one-child policy can only be part of the problem given that so many other countries are affected. In fact, the destruction of baby girls is a product of three forces: the ancient preference for sons, a modern desire for smaller families, and ultrasound scanning and other technologies that identify the sex of a fetus. In societies where 4 or 6 children were common, a boy would almost certainly come along eventually. Son preference did not need to exist at the expense of daughters. But now couples want 2 children, or as in China, are allowed only 1, and they will sacrifice unborn daughters to their pursuit of a son. This is why sex ratios are most distorted in the modern open parts of China and India. It is also why ratios are more skewed after the first child. Parents may accept a daughter first time round, but will do anything to ensure their next and probably last child is a boy. The boy-girl ratio is above 200 for a third child in some places. And it goes on to say that this can be stopped. Baby girls are victims of a malign combination of ancient prejudice and modern preferences for small families. Only one country has managed to change this pattern. In the 1990s, South Korea had a sex ratio almost as skewed as China. Now it's heading toward normality. It has achieved this not deliberately, but because the culture changed. Female education, anti-discrimination suits, and equal rights rulings made son preference seem old-fashioned and unnecessary. The forces of modernity first exacerbated prejudice, then overwhelmed it. They insist that the one-child limit is no longer needed to reduce fertility in China. All countries need to raise the value of girls. They should encourage female education, abolish laws and customs that prevent daughters inheriting property, make examples of hospitals and clinics with impossible sex ratios, get women engaged in public life using everything from television newsreaders to women traffic police. Any reactions to this? Have you been concerned or thought about this before? Yes, yes. Uh-huh. Is this a recent book? Uh-huh. Okay, well, it sounds like we perhaps found the source of this article. Because the last sentence, which I didn't read to you, is the world needs to do more to prevent a gendercide that will have the sky crashing down. So this is what happens. The editors of The Economist happen to hit upon a book, and they read it, and the next thing you know, it's an editorial on the front page. Right, yes, they cite that too. Although they attribute it to Mao Zedong, rather than just a Chinese proverb, but nonetheless, women hold up half the sky. Any other thoughts about it? How do you situate this in relation to Pierce's argument? I mean, they both seem to be saying they're in agreement. Fertility rates are falling, population growth is declining, and this is true everywhere, and therefore we, have to sort of take it seriously. And then yet at the same moment we see that it's, even within that, you have another trend that begins to look not only insidious, but actually extraordinarily, discriminatory, prejudicial, immoral. Any other thoughts? Yes? Okay, perhaps we're being a little quick to judge other people by our own standards. Is that? Is a certain amount of cultural relativism called for in this situation? Let them figure it out? Are humans smarter than yeast? Okay. Yeast will keep producing until it destroys its own basis, yes? Okay, so if we're concerned about gender inequality and violence and discrimination, we shouldn't only point to other parts of the world, and we probably also shouldn't only point to this phenomenon, right? It certainly can't be said that imbalance in sex ratios among children is somehow the only cause of gender violence and inequality. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So the sort of the local cultural mores or norms are only part of the story here. The preference for sons, for example, it only becomes a gendercide if that is then intersected by these technologies and the growth of global, growth in economic well-being, which drives this declining fertility. And then that's when this preference for sons over daughters begins to actually cause daughters not to be born, right? Rather than simply for sons to be preferred and girls to be born in roughly equal numbers. Again, though, I guess I want to connect this back to Connolly again. The Economists, the very framework in which they are thinking very nicely illustrates what Connolly is describing as having emerged only in the late 19th century, right? This use of demography, and questions of how to control population growth, how to control, for instance, the ratio of sons to daughters, as a way of addressing social problems, right? As a way of trying to address issues of gender violence, crime, that kind of thing. There is a kind of position taken by the writers in even thinking these thoughts, a position of having this perspective of data collected in different parts of the world and assembled and analyzed in such a way as to reveal patterns that then seem to suggest approaches that presuppose certain kinds of power and presuppose categories that can be studied at the scale of nations or regions or the world as a whole, right? And I guess this is the thing I want to come back to as we take up Connolly's argument. He's looking at the emergence of what he describes as a way of thinking about political issues and governance issues through the lens of demography and population control. So the struggle to control world population is only made possible by certain structures of data collection and analysis that themselves date to precisely the same period that Davis was talking about, right? Modern demography emerges at about the same time as modern climatology. And the collection of data about populations enabling certain kinds of power coincides with the collection of data about the climate, which also enables certain kinds of power. And these things actually fit together. And perhaps the common critique that could be offered of both of these articles is to question that framework itself, right? To question the efficacy or even the ethics of thinking about these problems in terms of populations, right? And Connolly's going to detail for us the ways in which thinking in terms of populations runs the risk of trampling on individual people and individual rights, right? By grouping them under these categories and then erecting policies aimed at those categories without respect for the specific circumstances of individuals trying to deal with their situations. Okay, 5-minute break, and then we will come back and talk about Connolly. Okay. Let's talk about Connolly and his book, Fatal Misconception. This figure is from the introduction, as you can see, page 3. World population growth from 1750 to 2050 from the UN Population Division, the solid line indicating overall global population size. And we see that it rises from less than 10 million, or 10 billion. No, I'm sorry. Over here, this is the number. Okay, well, roughly 1 billion in 1750 to a projected 9 billion in 2050. Right now, we're somewhere in here. The bars representing the annual increment, the growth in world population on average for a given year, annual average for a given decade. And you see that that is increasing from less than 10 million per year to a peak of over 80 million per year in the 1980s. And then declining, it's now roughly 7 million a year, or 7 million a year, 70 million a year, that's right. And is expected to drop off to less than 40 million a year by the 2040s. Now, basically, this forms the backdrop of Connolly's book, or rather the events that Connolly is looking at. He's interested in events, particularly in the 70s and 80s, the responses taken globally to address the problem of population growth, obviously in a context of very rapid increases beginning in roughly the 1930s and accelerating through the 50s and 60s when we had these high points of annual population growth globally. In his preface, he sets out this phenomenon, this issue, what exactly is he talking about when he talks about the struggle to control world population? First of all, it should be noted that he's not only talking about the struggle to reduce or slow the growth of world population. When he says control world population, he's talking about efforts on both sides. Efforts among some people to slow the growth in population and control population that way, and among other groups to prevent those types of measures or to obstruct those kinds of measures. People who insisted that those measures were wrong and insisted on pro-natalist policies. And here we might actually remember what Daley described in Brazil in the 60s and 70s, right? He said that on all sides there were parties who, for a variety of different reasons, some of them at odds with each other, nonetheless were opposed to family planning and birth control. Whether it was the Marxists who wanted more working class, or the military who wanted more foot soldiers, you name it, or the Catholic Church that just felt that birth control was morally wrong. So the struggle is about control in the broad sense of population. Yes? What is Connolly's position? Anybody have a sense of that yet? Is it too soon to say? Probably too soon to say. Is his position the same as his dedication to his parents? Thank you for having so many children. I think that's at least a little bit tongue-in-cheek. He's probably just saying, well, at least I was born. Thanks, right? My sense is, and it will come out actually here in the next couple slides, my sense is his position is that if he's on the side of any one player in this, he's on the side of the people who got trampled in between, right? In other words, he's on the side of the victims of this, whom he will describe as basically being everyone affected by these policies who didn't have input into their formulation, right? And he's interested in the power imbalance between the people who crafted and debated and implemented these policies on the one hand, and essentially the parents, the grown-ups, the adults, both male and female, but perhaps particularly female, who suffered the consequences of these battles. And it's the needless suffering. I mean, when The Economist reviewed this book and they put it on, it got blurbed on the back, if I remember correctly. You know, the real tragedy of this story is not simply that these efforts were unjust, that these policies resulted in injustice. It's the added fact that they also didn't work, right? If all of these programs and policies identified a goal and implemented it and achieved the goal by means that were unjust, that would be bad enough. But for the means to be implemented and be unjust and not work makes it even worse. So I think that's sort of what Connolly is trying to draw our attention to. So he mentions at the beginning, sociobiologists have it backward. Our biology is becoming a branch of history subject to human will and human error. Who's he referring to here? Do you know? The sociobiologists, he means who prominently? Doesn't mention him by name. Who's the most well-known sociobiologist? Anybody know? It's actually E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist, who is famous for a whole lot of reasons. One of them is a book he wrote called Sociobiology, in which he basically said you can explain everything about human society by thinking of it in terms of genetics and evolution, that it's all biologically encoded, genetically encoded. And I mean, he's flipping around. I mean, the sociobiologist's position is that human history can basically be reduced to biology, that society itself is a function of biology and genetics, not other things that we think of as somehow social. Connolly is saying, no, you got it wrong here. This is a story about the fact that population itself, which is obviously a fundamental biological concept, has become something that can be willfully controlled or manipulated, whether it's through efforts to implement birth control programs using contraception or other means, or whether it's through other kinds of programs and policies, right? Educating women is a way of controlling the population. The Economist is articulating that as of just last week, right? There are policies you can implement to control the makeup and size of the population of countries and of the world. Controlling how a nation reproduces itself has provided an alternative approach to policing a nation's borders, one measured in time as much as space. And here, there are interesting echoes of Foucault, basically, in this introduction. The idea that in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the very phenomenon of migration, massive migration, the emigration of 30 million Europeans, for example, and the movement of those people across nation-state borders, and the subsequent sort of mixing and the interbreeding, so to speak, of groups that had previously been categorized as separate, creates a kind of fear or sense of disorder and chaos among nation-states. States thinking about their sovereignty had previously relied on borders to sort of control where people went and the movement of goods and money and that sort of thing. And in a time when those borders begin to look porous and those categories begin to look unstable, he suggests this is an alternative approach in which instead of just policing your borders, you think about how populations reproduce themselves biologically, you know, literally the act of having children. And this becomes a way of trying to exert power and reassert the primacy of the state in the face of these dramatic changes. He says, from this perspective, you can notice that neo-Malthusians, eugenicists, pro-natalists, and nativists all began to organize at the same time, a time in which the world had begun to seem small, while population trends appeared out of control. Population change and struggles to control it are interconnected and transnational phenomena and should be studied as such. He's insisting here, if we need to understand control, not simply as reduce, but as control in both directions. And he also insists that this should be thought of not as an international phenomenon, but as a transnational and global phenomenon. In other words, you can't just understand this by looking at it in one nation, then the next nation, then the next nation. It doesn't make sense that way because the dynamics of this struggle are themselves about networks across borders between nations. I mean, he has that comment that it might make more sense to think about city-to-city relations mediated by some of these non-governmental groups and foundations and funding mechanisms.